I think there's a certain type of exhaustion that comes with not being who you are. And I'm really tired of having to not conform. Conform's the wrong word. It's become a commodified object that can be sold and whose skills can be traded on a market. And I know that that's how capitalism works. I'm fully aware of that. And there are, of course, wonderful things about capitalism, as there are terrible things about capitalism. And this is not a political economy essay. I took political economy in my first year of university and briskly transferred to philosophy and English. So that's my entire understanding, 1 year's worth of study, and it came from Adam Smith and nothing more. So very limited knowledge there. However, that's already by the by. This very short video is essentially a way of remaining accountable, not just to myself, but to the world, even though I have, I think, about 24 subscribers, 24 beautiful subscribers, but 24 subscribers. I'm absolutely disgusted by the extent to which we all need to be something that we're not in order to make money or support ourselves or to integrate into society or to make it look like we belong to aspects of culture or places or people that maybe we don't even agree with. And thereupon, I have decided to not do anything in my life that is not in accordance with my own spirit, which, wish me luck. This is a very, very difficult task, and I do not think I shall necessarily succeed, but I'm going to try. I will either get heavily castigated and end up a pauper on a nearby street in Istanbul, or be successful, and I pray that it shall be a success, however that may take form. And let's think about actually what success would mean if we all started to be exactly as we are, not anything but that. Well, success would be, I suppose, freedom, liberty, not just in speech and action, but and nor in a utopic sense. I don't mean that we should all just go around, not working for years on end because we think for some hedonistic reason that would be a good idea. I'm not supporting nor suggesting that. However, I am putting forward that I do not believe we should create content online or, things at work, slide decks at work or proposals at work, just because we think, and for no other reason, just because we think that it will make us popular or make us rich or get some material gain. Of course, if you do things with meaning and then the consequence is some financial reward, I'm not complaining. I think that's great. That's actually how you want to live your life. But I'm really sick of scrolling on content that is not only brain rotting, but also just so not in accordance with who that person is. They're just doing it for money and for likes. And I can understand why that's appealing. When I worked in corporate settings, you do that as well. You say and do things not because you agree with them, but because it's the correct or right thing to do in the circumstance in accordance with the social milieu that you are surrounded by, and you're very afraid of losing your job, so you just nod your head and continue on your way. And I'm not saying that there isn't merit in that, in the sense that maybe you have children to feed and maybe you need to put housing over your head, and all of those things are very brilliant and wonderful indeed, particularly in relation to the latter. That's why this video is perhaps a little contrarian to my best interest to an extent, because I also need a roof over my head. However, I'm going to take a bit of a risk, and I think, could be wrong. It could perhaps pay off to just be exactly as I am, think and say exactly as I am, and not write thumbnails or articles or books or short stories because I think it will have commercial appeal or because people will click on it, but because it accords with my own soul and spirit, and I'm going to attempt to live every day of my life in such alignment. Now, whether or not that's a good idea, of course, we all have parts of our psyche and our being that need to be transformed into better things. For example, you might think that a primary attribute of your being is that you love wearing yellow. Now, that's a good example for me. I don't particularly suit, I've been told multiple times I don't suit yellow, but I love yellow and I wear it a lot of the time anyway. That does absolutely no harm to anybody else. And in fact, it's actually good for our economy because not a lot of people buy a crap ton load of yellow like I do. So, you know, someone's got to fill that market. That's me. However, there are going to be some parts of my personality and attributes that are perhaps not best to live in accordance with, and to perhaps trump them with other aspects of being. So, for example, sometimes, if we were to think of the 7 deadly sins, I think my worst one is sloth. I tend to sit and nihilistically review every aspect of life rather than just doing it. I have a terrible, terrible tendency to just sit and, I suppose, waste all of the time I've spent reading and learning, whether it was at university or outside of university. I absolutely pillage my own town insofar as I take groceries from the store. I pay for them, but I give nothing back because I'm just so incredibly slothful sometimes. Not out of sheer laziness, but often out of fear. I'm really terrified of the world, which if you study the world enough, I think that's actually justified. But the importance is knowing exactly how terrifying and fearful the world can be and deciding to be courageous anyway. Courage is predicated on actually understanding the issues and the problems of the world and just how horrifically abhorrent the world can be, but buckling up anyway and saying, okay, this is the landscape that I have incarnated into, and thus I have no other choice than to bravely charge ahead as I am, unedited, unabbreviated, and as scary as that is. Perhaps actually, and this is a slight tangent, perhaps a lot of people that are slothful, such as myself, perhaps we are just a lot of the time scared. Whether or not that's justified is another thing, but we're scared. And perhaps our greatest sin is actually a lack of courage. So, what would be an incredibly courageous, almost immersion therapy level thing to do? Well, it would be to probably record this and then publish it and then keep writing. Thankfully, this year I've been published twice already, which is very exciting. Once in nonfiction and once in fiction by 2 very different publishers, and they've both been wonderful. But again, both of those things I realized were written in accordance with what I truly believed. I spent many years, you see, the people that tend to win big financially rewarding poetry competitions or writing competitions often write in a very postmodern style. Now, whether or not you like that is another thing. That's an entirely different video, an entirely different conversation, and postmodernism can be great. But it's not usually what I write in, not because I don't like it, but because it's just not really expressive of who I am or what I tend to read the majority of. Usually we're good at writing stuff that we've read a lot of. So, for example, most of my books, even when I was a young girl, I would read lots of romantic poetry. I have a photo of me when I was very, very young. I think I was about 11 or 12, and I had Endymion by John Keats in my hand, and I fell very deeply in love with romanticism, for better or worse. There's actually a lot of bad things about falling in love with romanticism, and I can discuss that later, but I tend not to write in postmodernism because I just haven't read as much of it. However, what I wanted to do, whether it was for ego or pride or probably more financial matters, I started to write in ways that did not accord with my own spirit. I'd write in fragmented sentences, or I'd write plot lines I didn't necessarily agree with but I thought might win because that sort of thing had won in the past. I wrote about themes and topics I understood because I read and studied and critiqued even myself when I was creating little dialogue in my head about the topic, but I wrote so much and I spent so much time writing about things I don't agree with, or I don't even think expresses my opinion or who I am as a fragment of the universe. If I am just a mere fragment of the universe, it wasn't authentic to what I believed. And it's probably one of the scariest things, to actually write something in a way that expresses your own psyche while also expressing your being. It's perhaps one of the bravest expressions of authenticity. So I'm now going to go on a bit of a mission in writing things that only accord both with my own personal writing style, but also with my being. And I'm very grateful that I found 2 publishers to actually like them this year. That's been an amazing experience and perhaps quite affirming, because all those things that I wrote that I thought would maybe win me some money or win me some sort of recognition failed miserably, thankfully. They failed miserably. Perhaps it's quite obvious that I don't agree with what I'm writing. I had a very good lecturer once when I was at university. He had a PhD in physics and a PhD in philosophy. This man was beyond any concept of intelligence. And I remember on one of my papers, his feedback, I'd written a comparative study of Heidegger and Irrigare. Irrigare does like a rewriting or a reimagining of Heidegger's work, particularly Being in Time. And he wrote on the side, "This is a very good argument, Charlotte. However, it is quite clear that you yourself do not agree with it." And I think it's interesting that just from the way that I'd written, perhaps because I'm so incredibly opinionated, it had come across that I'd just written what I thought the markers were looking for rather than what I actually believed in. The following essay that I wrote for him, I made sure that I'd written in accordance with my own belief system. I'd written a comparative between the Hermes Trismegistus and Hegel's use of the word being. Quite tangential and random, much like my own brain, but that one got top of the class, that essay. The other essay did not. The one that I attempted to argue about Heidegger and Irrigare, that did not do very well. But the one where I had written in accordance with my own spirit, that one did incredibly well. And I think that's a message, whether you believe in God or gods or the universe or whatever it is that you believe in, higher self, all that sort of thing. That is definitely a message from somebody telling me that I need to write in accordance with my own thoughts and experiences. So, this small testament that I'm creating here is more a confession, I suppose. Confessing my sin of greed and sloth, perhaps a little bit of hubris as well, as all good tragic heroes would have. But I don't want to be a tragic hero. I don't want to be so possessed by hubris that I cannot see my hamartia. Hamartia is, or hamartia, depending on how you pronounce it, is the tragic hero's fatal flaw. So you might have, for example, Othello. Everyone tends to do Othello in high school. Othello is so possessed by jealousy and envy that he cannot see properly what the truth before him. However, this envy is compounded by pride, by his arrogance. if he didn't have the arrogance and the pride, he'd be able to perhaps evaluate his own behavior. He would go, oh, I'm not a perfect living being. Okay, let me self-critique my own behavior. That would be incredibly good for Othello. Perhaps he wouldn't have killed, and he wouldn't have killed himself. The famous phrase, falling on one's own sword, is referenced in that stage direction, and perhaps even Shakespeare came up with it. That would sound like something Shakespeare would do, because Othello falls on his own sword. He falls on his own hubris and envy. And that is not something I intend on doing. So by confessing, we dissolve all attributes of pride, because we're saying, hey, I'm not perfect. And we're also acknowledging the fault within our personality that's stopping us from becoming an expression of self, in which case, for me, it would be, I say, sloth. And fear. Fear, definitely fear. And after such confession, I shall walk to the booth of life and open the door to a new reality that is completely constructed by a reflection of my own self, as terrifying as that may be. In a world that is so possessed by dopamine, by extreme behaviors that are called only with money and no other value, that are called with social acceptance rather than actual being, I'm going to do an incredibly terrifying thing, and I'm going to only record and write what I truly believe and nothing else. So, wish me luck.